Look around. What do you see? I see a symbol of free thought. I see a place where knowledge is ubiquitous. I see a university where information is passed around like dirty magazines in a high school washroom. I see privilege. But I want to encourage you to imagine a place where the exchange of ideas is not so free, where information is held under lock and key. I want to take you to a prison. I want to show you that access to information is the key to empowerment, and that empowerment is the key to safer societies. But first, I want to invite you into my library. Now, until I was 15, I had never been shushed in the library. I didn't really even know you were supposed to be quiet in the library. Growing up with a librarian as a mother, libraries had always been meeting places. Places to share information, to share ideas, and to share stories. So when I was shushed by my high school librarian, I was a bit shocked. It made me realize that not everyone saw libraries the way that I did. It made me realize that libraries must be reimagined in the way that people think about them. Because while many people, especially in university, still see libraries as quiet, studious, or reclusive spaces, in reality, libraries should be places that provoke discussion. They should be public spaces where people connect not only with the books that they read, but also with other members of their community. And most importantly, libraries should be spaces accessible by everyone. Just the other day, the library here at Carleton University hosted an event for Freedom to Read Week, where members of the community read aloud from books that have been the subject of censorship. So I was sitting in the reading atrium when I heard someone read aloud an excerpt about sodomy and the missionary position from Salman Rushdie's The Satanic Verses. I could see other people who had been lost in history texts or physics notes look up and were surprised to see that reading this provocative passage was Dean Osborne from the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. Many of them were obviously confused, but I can only hope that for some of them, hearing this controversial text read aloud in their public library allowed them to reflect on what it means to have such free access to these kinds of books. Because that kind of access is not available to everyone. In the era of the internet, some might suggest that the role of libraries can be fulfilled by other means. In other words, are libraries today redundant? The short, easy, and obvious answer, I think, is no. In 2005, the Vancouver Public Library began a community development program during which librarians visited halfway houses in the city's older neighborhoods. Many of the people living in these houses had been recently released from prison and had histories of substance abuse and addiction. The librarians visiting these houses went there without official documents, without folders, without briefcases, and they sat on the back porch and chatted with the people living there. They were listening for the kinds of information that the people living in the communities truly wanted and needed. And with this program, the library reached out to groups of people, and they provided these communities with access to services that they wouldn't otherwise have had. Because libraries today cannot wait for the public to come to them. They must go to the public. They must play an active role in ensuring that everyone, no matter their socioeconomic class, their race, their gender, their criminal history, has access to one of the most basic human rights, information. So that's my reimagined library. Now, I would not be giving this talk if it were not for two women who've been greatly influenced by their relationship with libraries. My mother, of course, and a woman named Suzanne, who's pictured here on the screen. My mother and Suzanne met each other through work over a decade ago and soon became close friends. It was through Suzanne that my mother became interested in prison librarianship, and that by extension, so did I. Before meeting my mother, Suzanne had been an inmate serving a federal sentence at the Edmonton Institution for Women, or EIFW, where she was the inmate librarian, a position which had a transformative impact on her. In her words, she told me, "When I first got to EIFW, I was afraid. I was ashamed. I was lost and all alone. My identity was replaced by a number, and I was labeled by the crime I'd committed. The library provided me with a purpose at a time in my life when I'd felt I'd lost everything." Now, some of you may be surprised to learn that prisons in Canada are actually required by the Correctional Services of Canada, or CSC, to have libraries within their institutions. As I'll talk about later, this mandate is not always carried out, but in the case of prisons that do have libraries, inmates are often employed as inmate librarians. And as the inmate librarian, Suzanne, and those who followed her engaged other members of the incarcerated community in programs offered by the prison library. This, of course, involved the loaning of books, but also included other programs such as book clubs, writing workshops, and author talks. Now, these programs, and prison libraries in general, are very important. According to Suzanne, libraries provide a healthy and positive activity to fill an inmate's time, and in the long run will lead to a safer reintegration and help create safer and healthier communities in which everyone will thrive. Now, the thing about prisons is that everyone has an opinion. Once you start asking people, you'll find that they're often more than eager to provide criticism or support for the most recent government policy regarding prisons. But when you actually take a look at that government policy, you'll find that prisons in Canada actually play a very specific, if not contradictory, role. On one hand, Canadian prisons are responsible for assisting in the rehabilitation and reintegration of offenders, and on the other hand, for carrying out sentences imposed by the courts. So you have punishment and rehabilitation, two seemingly opposite concepts. And governments around the world are constantly struggling with the best way to balance these two goals. At one point, Canada was seen as a leader in this balancing act. Today, however, the prison population in Canada is increasing, and Canada's correctional investigator has highlighted a growing number of concerns with regards to overcrowding, the treatment of prisoners with mental illness, the number of Indigenous inmates, and a lack of funding for prison programming. In 2013, the federal prison population in Canada was nearly 15,000, and that number had gone up by over 2,000 in the 10 years prior. At the same time, the crime rate in Canada actually went down. And the prison population in Canada is also becoming increasingly diverse. In a country where only about 4% of the population is Aboriginal, Indigenous inmates make up roughly 22% of the federal prison population. On top of this, that number has gone up by over 40% in the past 10 years, and Indigenous inmates consistently serve more time in solitary confinement and spend more time behind bars than other offenders. Kim Perry summed it up well in her article Books Behind Bars when she wrote that the justice system in Canada is working against Aboriginal and racialized people. The legacies of European imperialism, assimilation, and the genocidal policies of the residential school system persist today among Aboriginal communities in Canada. The living conditions on reserves continue to be far below, and the unemployment rates far higher than in the rest of the country. This has led to the marginalization of an already disenfranchised group of people, tearing Indigenous peoples away from their language, their history, and their culture, and leaving them prone to cycles of addiction and abuse. Monique Wurmann is a Winnipeg librarian who has volunteered in the prison library at the Winnipeg Remand Centre. She sees the high incarceration rate of Indigenous peoples in Canada as just one awful result of colonialism. Even after all the horrific things their ancestors went through, colonial policies are still working hard on these people, and they're ending up in jail, she told me. She sees libraries as being able to play at least a small role in reversing some of these devastating effects of colonialism. She told me, what colonization attempts to do to Indigenous people is to remove their personal power and their personal sovereignty. There are moments and tiny pockets of moments in serving people in the prison where we're able to let their personal power and their personal sovereignty speak and shine and be present. I think in the simple act of being able to choose what it is you want to read, that's one way of acting out some personal sovereignty. So this is where libraries come back into the picture, because not only have prison libraries been recommended as a tool for the rehabilitation of inmates, but they may actually have the greatest impact on those communities who are most vulnerable. As I mentioned before, prisons in Canada are required by CSC to have libraries. And when you consider the social responsibility that librarians have to reach out to marginalized groups, it makes perfect sense that libraries should play an important role within prisons. Monique described the social responsibility that librarians have within the context of her work in prisons in the following way. She told me, I do not see any difference between serving a patron at a public library or in a university library and between serving a patron who just happens to be living in the Remand Centre. Those are our community members living in that building. Sometimes they're in that building, and other times I'm sure I walk past them on the street. Now, a 1997 report by the John Howard Society formed a connection between prison libraries and the rehabilitation of marginalized groups when they came to the conclusion that library programs in the context of the justice system actually have the greatest impact when it comes to issues of gender equality, Aboriginal justice, and racial, ethnic, and cultural equity. At the same time, recent funding cuts to CSC have limited their ability to provide access to these programs within prisons. Howard Sapers, Canada's correctional investigator, recently warned that cuts to CSC have resulted in the closing of or the reduced access to some inmate libraries. Now, I'm going to jump back to Kim Perry for a bit, the Winnipeg librarian who wrote Books Behind Bars about her volunteer work in the prison library at the Winnipeg Remand Centre. The Remand Centre is a severely overcrowded facility in downtown Winnipeg. In 2012, it housed 406 inmates, but was only built to house 290. In her article, Perry writes that when she began volunteering in the prison with the Manitoba Library Association's Prison Library Committee, there was absolutely no library in the institution. Today, the committee goes into the prison every week for 2 hours and turns the room usually reserved for inmates to meet with their lawyers into what they call an open library. They take 2 cupboards filled with donated books, and groups of inmates are brought down to the makeshift library by prison guards. Despite the fact that this is a very basic service, truly a service that is far below what Canadian prisons should be required to provide, Perry feels certain that the connections made between inmates and books in the library is a powerful one. And the committee also arranges for local authors to come in and speak with inmates at the prison. One of these authors was local Anishinaabe academic and activist Niigaan Wewidam Sinclair, who read excerpts from the book Manitowapau, a collection of stories written by indigenous people from Manitoba. Now, many of the inmates at the remand knew the writers personally and were able to form profound connections with the stories told in the book. And Sinclair assured the inmates in attendance that the stories told between the pages were also their stories, that even behind bars, no one can take away the stories that have been passed down by generations of people in their communities. Another time, Métis writer Beatrice Mosinier, author of In Search of April Raintree, came to speak with inmates at the Headingley Women's Correctional Centre. April Raintree, which tells the story of 2 Aboriginal girls who were placed in foster care, is the most requested book at the prison, likely because many of the women are able to relate to the experiences told in the book. And when she visited the prison, she also visited the solitary confinement unit, which Perry described as being a particularly moving moment. She told me, "I will never forget how excited they were to meet her, even though it was through the food slot of their locked doors." Now, I'm sure that many of you can attest to the power that a book can have on you in the moment that you read it. So you might be able to understand why prison libraries are not only a way for inmates to pass the time during long sentences, but that they've actually been recommended as a program for the rehabilitation of inmates. And what I'm most interested in, and what I was trying to determine during the research that inspired this talk, was whether or not prison libraries actually have a positive effect on rates of recidivism. Now, recidivism is the term for when a released inmate reoffends, and is generally considered to represent a failure on the part of the justice system because the individual objects care and attention while behind bars. And to a certain extent, that does seem to be true. There does seem to be a correlation between the amount of programming that an inmate receives and whether or not that person will reoffend once they're released. For example, in an interview, Howard Sapers explained to me that inmates who are released on parole and who may have greater access to programming opportunities than other inmates will reoffend less than 5% of the time. Meanwhile, inmates who are kept until their statutory release date and who may not have access to these same types of programs will reoffend about 1/3 of the time. Now, when you consider this within the context of the rising prison population in Canada, this seems pretty problematic. And what I concluded from my research is that if you're able to provide inmates with access to books and other resources that will allow them to form connections both personally and intellectually, there is a possibility for great rehabilitation. In her article, Kim Perry talked about the magical experience of finding the right book at the right time, which will allow one to more fully investigate one's own life. In prison, inmates have nothing but time. This was a topic that came up often in my discussions with Suzanne. And so the more magical experiences and the more investigations of one's own life that are made possible behind bars, the more possibilities there are for personal rehabilitation and personal healing. So this is why the prison library is also part of my Reimagined library. Because libraries today cannot only be bastions of intellectual freedom, but they must also carry a social responsibility. They must be committed to providing access to services to everybody, to marginalized groups, to inmates, to released offenders, to indigenous communities, to people suffering from addiction. It seems that it's often these groups who would most benefit from the library. Now, I'm going to wind up my talk with another quote from Suzanne. She told me, by reaching those who want to change their lives, and by providing them with access to books, literacy, and knowledge, we are making a difference in working towards a safer and healthier society. Now, we've been hearing a lot lately from the media and from our institutions of power about safety. It's become a highly politicized term. But what is absent from this rhetoric of fear that surrounds this idea of safety is the consideration for Canadians from day to day. If you're putting more people in prison but spending less money on programming, that is not a commitment to public safety. If you're further marginalizing disenfranchised groups, instead of providing them with access to services that will allow them to reconnect with their history and their culture, that is not a commitment to public safety. So I'll leave you all with this. If it is truly a safer and more secure future that we're after, let's invest in bigger libraries and not bigger prisons. Thank you very much.